Thank you very much, Anita, and thank you very much for turning up. And as Anita said, this is the last lecture in this series. The first lecture I looked at Cai Guo Qiang as a global artist, and the second lecture I looked at his work as a land artist. And as Anita said today, I really wanted to look at his work within the context of performance and of participatory art as well. And I think to start straight off by showing this work, that I think the notion of performance itself is very important in relation to Cai's creative practice. And I think particularly in relation to the processes involved in something like his gunpowder drawings, which I'll look at a little bit later as well. I think he also is interesting because he combines performance and the spectacle, and I think in some ways his performances are a kind of spectacle. Well, there's the gunpowder works here, but I think particularly that idea of the spectacle is very germane to his fireworks events. And I think these fireworks events too are able to make his art much more accessible and entertaining for a broad global audience to enrich their cultural experience. So as I've mentioned in previous lectures, I think what's really interesting about Cai is that he's a kind of properly global artist. He's one of the very successful global artists today, and I think primarily because of works like the fireworks, where he's able to produce art for global audiences, and often works which might evoke a kind of very emotional response, which is, of course, emotions is something we all share. So it's sort of work that's able to communicate to that broader audience. In fact, you know, there's a lot about Cai, his work, which you would call populist, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. But one way I would describe Cai, I suppose, is to say that he's involved in participatory performance. And I think his success is very much predicated on his ability to communicate to and encourage the participation of global audiences he enlists. So it's not just about him communicating with broad audiences, it's also the way in which he enlists audiences to be part of the work. And with that, I think he is very much as well the self-aware performer of his work. And I think that being the case, we might want to consider some essential definitions of performance, because something called performance art really emerged in the 1960s, particularly took off in the early 1970s. And in that way, he does come out of that sort of context. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that first, certainly as a genre. I think first off, what one can say is there's certain definitions of what performance art can be. It can be many things, but those things include the fact that the artist does perform for an audience. So rather than producing an artwork, you might not even see the artist. You know, the artist might produce an artwork, you go into an art museum and you see that artwork. You don't necessarily see the artist, you just see his product. When the artist performs, you're actually seeing an actor. You see the artist who's actually working through, performing some sort of action. And the artists as well can see their own body as the artwork. So, sorry about that. I should have left it there, should I? I was just not sure it was being picked up. Yeah, give that a try. Sorry about that. Fine, yeah, okay, thank you. So also the artist can consider their body as an art object, as the actual art object as well. Performances can be, as I said, there's a myriad of ways in which an artist can perform. There can be random acts, spontaneous acts, that can be carefully orchestrated performances. They can be performed in the public sphere, or they can be performed in an art museum or their own studio. And sometimes those performances, for them to be complete, require the participation of an audience. So that's another way in which one might understand performance art. And there's some, obviously, history of this. This is a very famous work by the American artist Carolee Schneemann, her Meat Joy from 1964. It's about a kind of Dionysian abandonment. You know, they were kind of rubbing meat on themselves, a way of kind of re-engaging with the primitive, which was, of course, very popular in the 1960s as kind of consumer culture became more controlling, or at least sought to instrumentalise people's desires into purchasing a product. this sort of work was popular, where the idea of desire was meant to be maybe more primitive, centric, or to do with spontaneity. But the other thing too here, it's collective. I mean, it was her and other people that enacted that performance. And as well, it's also the performance itself is a kind of spectacle. It's carnivalesque, it's a kind of ritual as well. This is very popular in the 60s too, linked to that returning to the ritual. And we'll see this again with Joseph Beuys's work. And you can also look at this work as, the moving bodies. It's not a static artwork. It's something that, if the performer is acting, then there's going to be changes all along. People's bodies are going to change, and the colours and everything that are involved in that performance are going to change. So it does become a kind of moving painterly collage to some degree. And I suppose rubbing meat on yourself, and the meat is a kind of painting, or at least a kind of mark making as well in a work like this, which is very interesting. But as I say, it was that desire to recapture a kind of natural sense of self, which, as many of you will know, was very popular with the counterculture. Of course, there's not so much of this happening these days, but there's certainly group participation is still a very popular form in performance art. And I think with performance art, and whether that participation is with the artist or with an art audience, sometimes the performance is live, sometimes it's mediated. It can occur anywhere, can be linked to other media, and can involve a suggested relationship between performer and audience. And an artist to recently look at that, and I hope no one's offended by the full frontal nudity there. But Beecroft did a lot of these works where she got fashion models to pose. So in effect, this is a kind of performance art, but it's not the artist who is performing here, it's someone else that she has employed to perform on her behalf, or to perform in order to make a certain artistic statement. And there's not just that notion of having someone else perform for you. In that sense, I suppose an artist like Beecroft becomes a kind of manager, an art director, by having these people perform. But also you have the idea where your fashion models are usually aesthetic objects, so there's that kind of link to aesthetics, and they are aesthetic objects to be looked at. But of course, when this works like this was shown at the Guggenheim, the girls, or the women here involved would often look at the audience, which sort of created a kind of self-consciousness. It broke with that kind of passive-active thing, which was another important aspect of performance art, that idea that in the case of the artist, by being the performer themselves, by being the action, they could break down the kind of passive or distanced relationship between the audience and the artist. The artist could get closer to the audience and therefore could make a stronger emotional impact as well. That was also part of the advantage of performance art. Now, in an ironic way, someone like Jackson Pollock was very, very important for performance art. I think he was not necessarily someone, I believe, who saw himself as a performance artist. Rather, he was just someone who performed in order to paint. A great modernist, of course, an abstract expressionist painter in the United States. And I think what was interesting, of course, what Pollock's shtick was, in a way, was the idea of the way that he did make his work. He did drip the paint onto the canvas, and the canvas was on the floor. And it was on the floor, and he would walk around the canvas, and as you can see here, sometimes he would walk on the canvas, and he would be dripping the paint on. And that dripping of the paint was, of course, an extension. It was very expressionistic. It was meant to be an extension and articulation of his own inner creative energy, his own inner genius in that sense. The other thing that's, of course, interesting about that was that he was filmed by people like Hans Naumuth, and that kind of idea of him doing this action, this active sort of work, became part of the kind of identity of this particular artist. It was a very important part of it. So much so that this work, for instance, was also called action painting. It became known as action painting. And of course, it's a kind of theatre as well. It's the theatre, it's the drama of that modernist kind of myth-making. because certainly this work is more modern than it is postmodern, and it takes itself very, very seriously. And it's like this kind of the performance, the action of the drama of artistic genius as it's elaborated and as it's articulated and expressed on a canvas. So he had all of that kind of stuff happening for him. And I think what was interesting, a lot of artists kind of picked that up. They picked up that idea of art as theatre and art as action. And it led to some of the work that I was showing to you by Carolee Schneemann and others. And you can see here as well, I mean, it's not such a long step from what Pollock was doing and the kind of postures that he assumed when he was making work to what Cai Guo Qiang has done with works like this Unmanned Nature Hiroshima from 2008. Like Pollock, Cai's drawing practice, this with the gunpowder, is a kind of performance. He approaches the working space, in his own words, as a field of energy, which he also relates to a stage set. So he's, kind of recapitulating in a way. He's recapitulating that idea of art making as a kind of performance, a theatrical performance on a stage, in a sense. I suppose more self-conscious, perhaps, in the case of Zhao. And it's the energy involved in that too, which is very important. That energy, when you think about it, creative energy, artistic energy, whatever you want to call it, it's an intangible thing. It's not something that you can just depict something like that. But it becomes valuable in the way in which Cai manages something like energy. Energy is about movement. And so this is something that's not easily seen, but something that can be more easily seen if it's performed rather than kind of articulated as a kind of singular work of art, which, as I said before, you might come upon in the gallery. I mentioned Joseph Beuys before. This is very famous work in the mid-1960s. Beuys was also someone, a bit like Schneemann in the sense that he was very interested in the pre-rational, the non-hierarchical. He was also someone who wanted to return art to a kind of ritualisation, which was, opposed to the kind of, I suppose, consumerist sophistication and civilisation of Western society in the 1960s. And also, what this work involved basically is he had applied gold leaf and honey to his head, and then he had a dead hare, as you can see here, as expressed in the title. He did this performance, and he was in a gallery with paint pictures. You can see some of the pictures behind him. And at a certain moment, the audience were excluded from the exhibition, though there was glass in the doors and they could look through. And what he then proceeded to do for 3 hours solid was look at various pictures in that space and explain those pictures to that dead hare, often in almost whispering to that kind of taxidermied critter. And by doing so, it's very kind of arcane, kind of hermetic work by Beuys often. But in this case, it's been argued that what he was trying to do was, I suppose, work through the drama of art, that art symbolises certain things, that art kind of seeks to communicate certain ideas. And in the struggle to communicate those ideas to something which is inanimate or something that can't listen is kind of part of art's struggle. It's the part of what the artist is supposed to do, is to somehow find some way of communicating their ideas. And the hare, as well, has a long history, symbolic history of fertility, and Beuys claimed it was about incarnation. So I think as well what the hare was meant to do in a work like this was, I suppose, to promise a revitalisation, or at least promise a way in which art could be taken on by an audience, that certain forms of art and communication could be taken on by an audience, and that audience would then be kind of revived by that, in a progressive kind of way. But, that's just what I've outlined to you, is a very ambitious plan for what art can do, and that is, he found that the best way to articulate those ideas was through performance art. Of course, the other thing about Beuys is he also wanted people to be aware that what he called social sculpture was he wanted the audience to be aware of their own creative and artistic capacities. That was very important for him. And so I'd also like to say that examples like those two, they do fit into Xai's gunpowder and fireworks art that he has produced, which, as I've said before, is a kind of performance art. And this work, the Dragon or Rainbow Serpent, was a work that he did there in the 1990s. And for Cai, in using a material like gunpowder, he has described it as an active agent, and which he has produced in a series of artistic actions. So I think here the point I want to make is how central the idea of activity of performance is to what Cai did. And of course, I refer you back to the description of Pollock's work as action painting, and Cai calls his own work actions. He's also stated about gunpowder that, well, these gunpowder works at least, that they represent, quote, an intensive battle between power and material. In this confrontation between control and anti-control, between form and canvas, I try to vividly present the process of exchange between design and materials. So I suppose the point there for him is using performance again to be able to, I suppose, express a more dynamic relationship between certain things, and a bit like a shaman as well, the kind of assuming the kind of role that Boyce did, that somehow the artist has knowledge to be able to manipulate these forms of energy or processes of transformation, which I'll talk a little bit about just in a moment, or about spontaneity, that the artist is somehow can recognise and, even though not entirely control these processes, set them in motion, and can only do so through the idea of performance. And gunpowder, if you think about it, burning, it's a kind of material that once it is burned, once it comes in touch with an element like fire, burns very brightly, and then is transformed into something else, kind of charcoal or whatever that might be. So this is something that Cai is very interested in, this idea of the transformation of matter. And the role, he's also said that the role of art in society is not to resolve conflicts, rather is to express these conflicts and antagonisms. And perhaps one criticism of Cai has been that he avoids any he avoids any direct political comment on anything. He was, he did the fireworks displays, which I'll show you, for the Chinese government in the Beijing Olympic Games in 2008. And he's been criticised by some for just kind of being a careerist without really thinking about how what he does affects maybe situations in countries that he's working in. But for him, he doesn't want to kind of present solutions to particular problems like terrorism or something like that. He just wants to kind of exemplify them or show them as happening, and those processes are both positive, there's destructive aspects, there's constructive aspects, and he just sees his art as kind of articulating conflict rather than trying to resolve that conflict. And he sees gunpowder as a very good form for which he can do that. I think the other thing too is gunpowder does have, very strong resonance with Chinese history, with Chinese people. Gunpowder was, of course, discovered by Chinese alchemists who were seeking to discover an elixir of life, looking for that medicine that would ensure longevity or even immortality. And I think Cai's interest in gunpowder is like the alchemist who can transform matter, and gunpowder's matter, but also towards kind of metaphorical dimensions and in relation to a kind of, if once lit, the gunpowder kind of undergoes this miraculous combustion and, spectacular kind of fire, which then leaves it as once it's burned, you are left with another matter. Maybe it's about the miraculous itself that Cai is kind of working through. And I think using the material itself, like gunpowder, as a kind of performer, because it's a kind of dynamic energy, it's a process which happens over time and then, then delivers a kind of result. So in this way, I think, as I said, the gunpowder burn is itself can be viewed on as the art, as a very important part of the art. As I said too, Zai is very taken with the idea that destruction can be beautiful and also creative. He has said, quote, "The relationship between destruction and creation, its uncertainty and accidental and uncontrollable nature is something he finds particularly attractive." And as I said as well, a bit like the shaman, he also in some ways manages it. He at least sets up the situation and the event that will occur. And by being accidental, by being uncontrollable, he sees those kinds of results as being creative in some ways. And a form of painting with the same problems as painting. You've got sculpture, composition, brightness, rhythm, all of these kinds of things. So many of his, so I've just missed a point there. So many of his gunpowder and fireworks art could be also described as participatory performances, the term I used earlier, because Zai often enlists audiences to help him prepare for the work, and as well, they are the observers of the action that often unfolds. And some are very well known, as in this one, the Project for Extraterrestrials. This was a very beautiful, sublime and awe-inspiring work. The scale is phenomenal. I think that's also very important for Tsai's appeal to global audiences. He's very good with the spectacle, produces, kind of awe-inspiring spectacles, which all audiences can kind of recognise and appreciate. In this case, he lay out 10 kilometres of fuse and gunpowder clusters near Jiaoyuan in Gansu, which is the edge of the Gobi Desert, and made with the participation of a group of volunteers who helped him do this. And this area where this was laid was where the Great Wall ends. And when it was detonated, as you can see the detonation process here, the explosion slithered in a red line on the horizon to form an ephemeral extension of the Great Wall. So it's an interesting kind of ambition to do, because in a way he as the artist is making a claim for having the power to extend the Great Wall, which is a magnificent historical achievement. So he places himself in that role of a kind of builder of Chinese culture. And of course, the Great Wall is, it's a very famous global phenomenon. It's very popular, of course. The Chinese people were very proud of the Great Wall for good reason, and it's also a sign of a kind of enduring power or a kind of endurance. That China, of course, China is the oldest nation state in the world when it was established by Emperor Qin, and so the Great Wall is a kind of sign of that, sign of cultural pride. It's also a sign of terrestrial magnitude, a sign in which the Chinese have been able to conquer nature in that way. Of course, it was built to keep out the marauding hordes, but it's also a work of great ambition which could show what human beings could do. And I think this is what he's kind of tapped into. He's used that very rich history to extend his idea. And more than that, there was an audience of 40,000 people that saw this. So there's, it's a bit like, if the tree falls in the forest, does it actually happen if no one sees it? Certainly in the case of a work like this, you need that audience for the work to be completed. And, the more audience you have, the better. And as I said, 40,000 people from the city of Jiaoyuan saw this particular work. The people too were given different Chinese medicines they could take before and after the ignition to stimulate and calm their energy. So I think that's a really interesting extension of what the artwork is, and the audience's participation in that. Even in some ways, their body chemistry is transformed in some ways, and maybe in similar ways to the way that the gunpowder might be transformed into fire. And this work lasted for 15 minutes, and it was meant I spoke earlier about the slithering kind of red line of the explosion. It was meant to represent the dragon, which of course is a very important mythological figure in Chinese culture, and of course a ubiquitous image. So it was also tying into Chinese cultural history as well. But it's a local event. It has very strong Chinese resonances, as I've already said. But also he called it extraterrestrials because he wanted, it's often stated that astronauts, of the human-made structures on Earth, they often see the Great Wall. The Great Wall, it can be seen from a long way away. He wanted a similar kind of idea for people to be able to see this fireworks explosion from outer space as a way of, as he said, of communicating to potential extraterrestrials that might be out there. I don't know how seriously to take that claim, but certainly the idea of, if he's using a kind of form which is globally appealing, why not, appeal to an audience beyond the world in a way? Maybe they too can appreciate this kind of work. And two, just to add some further points, fire is of course an ancient and constant element of geological formation, so he's kind of using aspects of the earth, he's harnessing those things, and of course he's recognising the importance that fire and gunpowder can have in social, ritual and religious rites, purification, fire is often used for that, and a spectacle of primal power. And also as the performing artist, shaman, he sort of plays the geomancer who directs kind of feng shui energy as well. He's very ambitious in that way. And he's a master illusionist who uses art to inspire the imagination and to aspire to kind of metaphysical life. In that way, it's not that different from the paintings of mountainscapes by German romantic painters in the early 1800s, at least in their commitment to kind of making the audience aware of a kind of sublimity. And I think Cai has very much tried to do the same thing with a lot of his work. This is, as I mentioned, the kind of work that he managed the fireworks display at the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And just a point about that, Cai, who lives in New York and has for many years, was obviously well enough connected with the Communist Party in China to get this kind of role, which he was very successful and which I'm sure he was richly rewarded for. Other artists like Ai Weiwei started working in the Olympics, and he was very disturbed by the kind of human rights stuff that was going on with builders and that, and he couldn't morally kind of continue to do that, and so he eventually dropped out and later on was beaten up by the Chinese police. So I think they're two interesting figures if you're interested in pursuing it as contemporary global Chinese artists, the way in which they've negotiated the Chinese political situation at the moment. It's a bit of a digression. So fireworks are important. They originated in China during the Han Dynasty, which was around 200 BC to 200 AD. It was originally used to frighten and ward off evil spirits. Apparently before that, people in the Han Dynasty would throw empty bamboo stems into a fire, which would produce a loud bang. And these, after the stems burnt and crackled in a fire for a while, they would explode. And the Chinese saw this explosion as loud enough to scare away evil spirits and getting rid of evil forces, which of course would then bring greater sense of happiness to the community. And so the bursting of these bamboos became very closely associated with associated with joy and also a kind of celebratory thing. Gunpowder was later used and then put into the hollow bamboo tubes in order to produce louder explosions. And today China is the largest manufacturer and exporter of fireworks in the world. So it's a very strong context, cultural context, that Cai works from, very identifiable. They are explosion events. They're powerful forms of time-based and transient art. And as art performances, they both conjure up a kind of sense of chaos because they can be frightening in some ways, as well as a kind of ritual celebration. And as I've said before too, they kind of produce transformations And they can produce something out of nothing. You've just got a bit of black powder, you put a match on it, and whammo, you've got completely a kind of spectacular chemical transformation occurs with that. So it's very good for him. He's used Chairman Mao as well to explain his art, particularly Mao's dictum, no destruction, no construction. So it's Dai's always argued this idea that, if from destruction can come a kind of creative process. Now I want to talk now about his relationship to participatory art, which is very popular, has been very popular in global art for the last 25 years or so. And just a very brief history of this, the idea of participation, of having the audience involved in the making of art, is something that's been around for at least 100 years. The futurists, what they would do is they would have evenings where they would seek to provoke the audience and generate situations in which they would create a right. And once that right had been created, that was the point of the work, was to have that kind of destructive energy which groups of people could produce. And they were linked to kind of more of a right-wing, Marionette ended up being a good friend of Mussolini's, but that kind of idea that they were arguing that destruction was good because from destruction came rebirth. And on the left side of the political spectrum, you had Russian artists like Mayakovsky. He did one work where he got a whole lot of workers in factories in a particular city to start blowing the factory sirens at a particular time. So he had this kind of orchestra of factory sirens. He was the conductor, but the work was produced by, the normal kind of Russian worker. That the worker and the participation, the group audience was the artistic creator. Really, they were making those things. And into the post-war period in the United States, you had something like happenings, which have been very important. Alan Capra is a very important figure here. He would set up certain rooms that people would go in, and there'd be certain instructions, like you could ring a bell or do something like that. And of course, that work there, when you look at it without people, it's only half there. The work can only be completed by people walking through and doing certain things and acting in spontaneous ways. And to the point where you get this in 2008, a work by the artist Liam Gillick called Any Space Whatsoever, which was a reflection of the kind of, I suppose, renaissance of participatory art, which occurred really from the 1990s and is still going in one way or another. Gillick was part of a group which is described as relational aesthetics. And basically what this was the idea that you only ever use an object in an art show and an art gallery in order to create a social situation. So the object in itself was not important. The object was only a means to an end. So, for instance, the Thai artist Terry Benija had a show where it was called Pad Thai, and people walked into the gallery and the only thing you could do was cook. And so it was that cooking and people talking to each other and conversing to each other while they were engaged in that social situation, that was the work. And of course, with that notion is that, there would be no point, even though after all the cooking was done, there photographs of what was left, all the empty Coca-Cola cans and the woks and all of that sort of stuff. That was not the work, that was just evidence of what had created the work. And what was that work was, as I said, it was people conversing with each other. So a lot of this art was about creating a kind of sociality. But again, the important point there is to say that it's the audience that complete the work. The food, the Thai food, is no good without people cooking it and eating it and talking to each other while they're doing so. It's not a complete work unless that happens. So it was about fostering social relations. I only have so much time to talk about it. I think in one way, why did they do that? Well, I think they argued on one level, without wanting to overturn the system of consumer capitalism, they never wanted to do that. They did kind of argue that a lot of our relationships had become standardised, kind of instrumentalised in a kind of consumerist way. And so what they wanted to do was find other ways for people to relate to each other than seeing each other as products, basically. was one of their arguments. And to do that was they would have, games and festivals and other places of conviviality to create situations where people had dialogues. And this is a good example of this. This was in the Guggenheim. In fact, this was part of a major retrospective of relational aesthetics, which many critics said basically announced the end of it. But in this work here by Gillick, you're just walking up the Guggenheim spiral and you come across this bench. It's deliberately, it's a curved bench deliberately so that you have to sit next to people effectively, close to people so that you're encouraged to discuss. And then you look up and you see things like this fish or cut bait or something down strike, pen down strike, and you might look at the other person and say, well, what's this? How's this a work of art? And as soon as that person responds to you, that's the work of art. He's setting up a situation in which you begin to converse about something, in which you're actually talking to someone, and you're, hopefully in a convivial way. Critics have called this sort of stuff an arty party, that it's only really people who go to art galleries that can indulge themselves in this kind of idea of, hey, I spoke and it was a work of art. But certainly, the idealism in it was that idea of ushering in an openness in art. And of course, it's not that far away from that kind of idea to going to art museums and having balloons for the kiddies as they walk into the art space. That kind of idea of art as festivalism. Art becomes like the Ekka. Shows become like the Ekka, which it kind of taps into that idea of art increasingly being about entertainment in a global culture which is dedicated to leisure and entertainment. We're lucky enough that we are able to spend a lot of our time in leisure and entertainment, unlike some people in other less fortunate countries. And it's certainly been argued that artists have really, that's what they do now. They seek to entertain. And by doing so, what they try and do is they produce an art which is much more inclusive, which doesn't seek to speak down to people, but rather tries to include people in the conversation. And you can see why participatory art would be very popular for that reason, that you don't need an art degree to be involved. And I'll show you some work to make up in particular artwork. So it's a global audience. Zai, as I've shown you, is a fantastic exemplar of that kind of idea. And a global audience speaks different languages, has different educational levels, have different ethnicities, has different cultures. How are you going to appeal to that broad audience, to be successful? And I think with the works I've shown you by Zai, I think he shows one way of doing that. So also too, that sort of move towards populism, sort of more that idea that it's not enough anymore. People don't, in a culture very dedicated to entertainment, it's not enough for a lot of people just to go in and see a painting on the wall anymore. They want something a little bit more exciting. They want to go down a slide because, they're used to a culture which is always trying to give you another stimulating experience to do, whether that's climbing Mount Everest or going into outer space. It's kind of this idea that, buy the new kind of experience, the new kind of leisure. So it's the idea of art having to recognise that. And, as I said before, that anybody can go on this slide unless you've got, a pacemaker. I mean, you don't need a PhD to slide down this work and enjoy it. You can do it, and it's like what Andy Warhol used to say about Coca-Cola. The president can drink Coca-Cola and the bum on the street can drink Coca-Cola. It's the same Coca-Cola, and it's a bit this idea too. Anybody can do it, and by doing so, by going down that slide, you complete the artwork again. It's the audience's participation that completes this artwork. And, as I said, Hurler's work at the Tate Modern is a really good example of that. It appeals to the emotions primarily, which, of course, intellect may in fact have more of a range of different responses. Emotion is something that, all of us share. We all have anger. We all have fear or whatever that may be. And so, if you can relate to those emotional things, then you're going to be thinking about your client, the customer, the consumer. And of course, people these days as well, I think unconsciously, are looking at art as something they consume like any other kind of product. And other examples of that, with the 5 minutes I have to spare, there's been a lot of work along in that kind of mould. This is one example, Anthony Gormley, Blind Light. We had this kind of glass room which had dry ice in it, and you had to kind of wander around. I went in you had this in a show in New York, and I wandered around, and it was, once you were in the middle, of course, you didn't know where the edges were, and then you could hear people, but you couldn't see them. So it was a very different kind of what one would call a phenomenological experience. You'd kind of feel your way around, and that was a kind of very different kind of way of operating. So, you know, you did enter it, you did have an interesting experience, but at the same time it might have made you think a little about how you negotiated space normally, and when your normal kind of signposts and directions are taken away, how do we respond as sentient beings to that? And I think Creed's work here at the gallery is along those lines as well. And you can see, I mean, the lady there on the right is absolutely delighted with this, and this lady on the left looks like she's grinning broadly as well. Again, you know, it's that idea which has become much more popular recently, that art is there for people to have fun, for people to be entertained. It's not something which should be there to kind of teach people about the progress of Western civilization and what they have to do to contribute to that momentum, etc. It's just more about entertaining people. You've had all kinds of weird and wonderful ways of doing this. This is an Austrian group called Gallatin who did this at the Hayward Gallery in London. So, and for many people, they wanted to do this because they might have been people living on the edges, commuter suburbs of London, and they'd heard about this work, and they wanted to go on a boat, you know, on a boat on a lake on top of the gallery in the middle of London as part of their day out. It wasn't necessarily because, you know, they wanted to learn something about art. It was because they wanted to get some sort of fun out of art. And there's less and less the counter pressure from critics or theorists who kind of claim, well, you can't do that. It's not really art. It's just a kind of selling out to kind of popular audience. And again, you know, I return back to Cai as I head towards the end of this lecture. Certainly, he himself has claimed that, you know, he was being influenced somewhat by Chairman Mao. Of course, communism, one might argue, is it's the left version of populism, as opposed to kind of consumer capitalism as being the right version of populism. But certainly that idea of, you know, of appealing to or communicating with the broadest possible audience. Instead of communist propaganda like socialist realism, what you have instead is Cai uses something like fireworks to communicate to people. And again, that idea of people becoming involved. It's the work he did in Los Angeles in 2012. It was set up with the help of 100 volunteers. It became then a kind of community of working together to produce this particular work. I just came across these on a website of someone who'd been in that group and sort of put these images online and was really very excited about the experiences they'd had with that. And just to move through, so the sort of works that he's done with gunpowder, and I suppose more strictly that sort of work I was showing you before, how Cai works fits into this. This was an arbitrary history river which was set up, I think it was in the Guggenheim somewhere, but it consisted of whiting, resin and bamboo riverbed filled with water, and you could go in small boats, as you can see, very popular with children. And also it's the novelty. I'm going into an art museum to ride on a boat in a river. Hey, that's really different. So novelty is incredibly important with this kind of stuff as well. And also impressive, people thinking, gee, you know, the amount of work that had to go into setting something like this up is really impressive. And I think just about finally, I've got a couple more. Another work he did, in this case, it was a large domestic bath, as you could see, and above this hung a banyan root with birds fluttering around it. Again, anybody can get into a bath, you know, unless you're self-conscious, you know. Anybody can do it, and everyone can immerse themselves in water and share basically the same kind of experience. The artwork provides you with that kind of novel experience as well, but you generally, yes, you all, in some ways you all share the same experience, but in some ways everyone responds in a slightly different way to that kind of experience. And finally, this is another work at GOMA where he set up, it was at the 3rd Australia-Pacific Triennial, he set up this bamboo suspension bridge over the water mall in the Queensland Art Gallery, and it involved the audience walking on this. There were 2 entrances, so often people would end up in the middle and someone would have to give way, maybe someone would have to go back, and so the decisions people made before they went onto this kind of bridge. There were laser sensors as well that triggered a fine mist of water from above when one reached the centre of the bridge. So that's, again, it's not just something you're seeing, it's something you're feeling. You're feeling the mist of the water as well. So that's seeking to expand your experience of the art in one way and expand your participation in that work. And also, you know, it's inclusive, it's welcoming. You know, and it sets up, in some ways, it sets up a bit of a dilemma, but you're having to negotiate with someone else that you don't know. So it's setting up that sort of social engagement. Since in some ways it owes a little bit to relational aesthetics. So anyway, as I'm running out of time, this was going to be the last week anyway, and I thank you very much for listening, and if you've turned up for more than one lecture, I hope you've enjoyed the entire series. Thank you very much.